My children once told me I eat but don't contribute. The words sliced through me sharper than any knife. I had given them my life, my health, my sleepless nights, and still. They looked at me as nothing more than a burden. That night, I packed my small bag in silence. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I simply closed the door behind me, knowing they had no idea what I was about to do. But what I discovered next changed everything. I was not born rich. I was not born lucky. My husband and I started our lives with almost nothing. A single-room home, second-hand furniture, and dreams bigger than our means. We worked side by side, morning till night. He in the fields, I taking small sewing jobs for neighbors. Every coin mattered. Every meal was earned with sweat. When our first child was born, we promised ourselves one thing. Our children would never know the hunger we once felt, and so we worked harder. We sacrificed more. I often went without shoes so they could wear proper ones to school. I skipped meals so their stomachs would be full. I hid my tears when I was exhausted because I didn't want them to see weakness. By the time my third child was born, we had managed to build a modest home. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with love. My husband's laughter filled the rooms. The children's footsteps echoed down the hall, and I felt, if only for a while, that all the sacrifices were worth it. But fate can be cruel. My husband fell ill when our children were still young. The sickness came suddenly and took him quickly. I was left a widow, alone, with 3 hungry mouths looking up at me. People told me to remarry, to find a man who could provide, but I couldn't. My heart belonged to my husband, even in death. So I worked, and worked, and worked. I became mother and father, provider and protector. I woke before dawn, took whatever jobs I could, and stayed up late mending clothes. I never complained. I never stopped, because I had promised them a better life. And for years, I thought I had succeeded. My eldest son became an engineer. My second son married into a wealthy family. My daughter, the youngest, moved abroad and often sent pictures of her life, smiling in front of places I'd only ever seen on TV. To anyone else, it looked like a story of triumph. A poor widow who raised successful children. People would whisper, "She must be so proud." But behind those whispers, cracks were forming. The first signs were small. My children no longer asked how I was, only what I had done for them. They grew impatient with my stories, the ones they used to beg me to repeat. When I gave them advice, they rolled their eyes. When I offered help, they brushed me aside. Still, I told myself, they are busy. They have their own families now. Be patient. So I stayed quiet. I cooked their meals. I looked after their children. I kept their homes tidy. I smiled, even when my back ached from bending over the stove all day. I told myself I was still needed, that in my quiet way I was contributing. But they didn't see it that way. It was during a family dinner when the mask finally fell. The room was filled with laughter, at least theirs. The grandchildren were playing, the television blaring, and the table heavy with food I had spent hours preparing. As I placed another dish on the table, I overheard my daughter-in-law's sharp whisper to my eldest son, "She eats but doesn't contribute. How much longer are we supposed to carry her?" I froze. The spoon trembled in my hand. I wanted to believe I had misheard. But then my son sighed and replied, almost casually, "You're right. Maybe it's time she moved into an old-age home." The room spun around me. I felt as if the floor had opened beneath my feet. I looked at him, my son, my flesh and blood, the boy I had stayed up with during fevers, the boy I had walked miles to school because we couldn't afford bus fare, and he looked back at me with indifference. The grandchildren laughed at a joke on TV, oblivious to the knife twisting in my chest. No one noticed my tears. No one noticed my silence. That night, I lay awake on the thin mattress in the small room they had given me at the back of the house. I stared at the ceiling, hearing their words over and over. "You eat but don't contribute," as if my worth was measured only in money. as if decades of sacrifice had vanished into nothing. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that maybe they had spoken in anger, but the days that followed proved me wrong. My daughter-in-law stopped serving me tea. The grandchildren stopped visiting my room. My son avoided my eyes. And when I offered to help with expenses, even though I had so little left, my son laughed bitterly. "What would you contribute, Mother? A few coins from your pension?" That laugh burned into me. I thought of all the nights I had skipped meals so he could eat. All the clothes I had stitched with bleeding fingers so he could walk into school with pride. And now, he laughed. I felt invisible, unwanted, discarded. But I didn't fight. Not yet. I smiled weakly. I kept cooking. I kept cleaning. I kept swallowing my pride. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. For years, hidden away in a small, locked box, I had kept something safe, something they had forgotten, something that could change everything. One rainy night, as I sat in my room with the sound of thunder echoing through the house, I pulled that box out from under my bed. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were old documents, papers my husband had signed before he died, papers my children had never bothered to ask about. I traced my fingers over the faded ink, a slow smile creeping onto my face. They thought I was worthless. They thought I had nothing left. But they were wrong, because in my hands was the key to everything. But what I discovered next changed everything. The documents in my hands gave me strength, but strength is not the same as peace, because each day that followed, the betrayal grew heavier. At first, it was in the little things. My son stopped greeting me in the morning. The grandchildren left dirty plates in my room as if I were the maid. My daughter-in-law snapped at me for using too much cooking oil. "Do you know how expensive groceries are?" she hissed one evening. "You just eat and eat, but you don't bring in anything, not a single coin." Her words stung more than fire. And what cut deeper was that my son said nothing. He just kept scrolling through his phone as though he hadn't heard. I wanted to scream, to shake him and remind him of every sacrifice. But instead, I swallowed my pain. I told myself, wait. Then came the humiliation. One Sunday afternoon, the whole family gathered for lunch. Even my daughter, who lived abroad, joined through a video call on the big screen. They laughed and talked, passing dishes back and forth, while I sat at the far end of the table, silent. When the topic turned to finances, my eldest son sighed heavily. "We're carrying too many expenses. The house, the kids, the car payments, and then there's—" He looked straight at me. "Another mouth to feed." My daughter-in-law nodded eagerly. "Exactly. If we keep going like this, we'll never save a penny. We can't keep carrying dead weight." Dead weight. That's what I was to them. Not a mother, not a grandmother, just weight. On the video call, my daughter gave a half smile and said, "Maybe Mom should just move to a care home. Isn't that better for everyone?" Laughter filled the room. Laughter. As if they were discussing some trivial matter, not the woman who had raised them from nothing. I felt my face burn with shame. I wanted to disappear into the floor. But worse than shame was the realization. They meant it. That night, I overheard them. From my small room at the back of the house, their voices carried clearly through the thin walls. "We can't keep her here," my daughter-in-law whispered. "She eats too much. She costs us too much. If she wants to stay, she needs to contribute." My son's reply was cold. "She doesn't have anything left. No savings, no property, nothing. If she did, don't you think she would have offered by now?" He chuckled. "She's just an old woman living off us." I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the weight of his words crush me. This was my son, my own blood, and he had stripped me of all dignity in one cruel sentence. The days blurred together after that. I cooked their meals, but they never said thank you. I folded their laundry, but they complained if it wasn't perfect. I watched the grandchildren, but when they grew bored of me, they shouted, "Go away, Grandma!" I became a ghost in my own home, invisible, unwanted, until the day it went too far. It was my birthday. I hadn't expected a party. I hadn't expected gifts. But I thought, just maybe, they would remember. I woke early, made myself presentable, and sat in the living room waiting. But the hours passed, and no one said a word. Not a single happy birthday, not even from my daughter abroad. When dinner came, I finally whispered, "Do you know what today is?" My daughter-in-law rolled her eyes. "Another bill to pay?" she sneered. The room erupted in laughter, even my son, even my grandchildren. They laughed at me on my birthday. I excused myself quietly and went to my room, tears soaking my pillow. That night, something inside me died. The mother who had forgiven, the grandmother who had stayed silent. She was gone. The very next morning, my son knocked on my door. He didn't come in. He just stood there, speaking coldly. "Mother, we've decided it's time. We found a nursing home. It's for the best." For the best. Those words echoed like poison. He said it with the same tone one might use for throwing out old furniture. I looked at him. I wanted to beg. I wanted to remind him of the nights I held him through storms, of the mornings I walked miles to get him to school, of the meals I had skipped so his plate would be full. But I didn't. I only nodded. "Of course," I said softly, and I closed the door. Behind that door, I clutched the documents tighter than ever. They had no idea. They thought I had nothing left. But the truth? I held more power than they could imagine. The days that followed were unbearable. They stopped speaking to me directly. When they did, it was only to criticize. "Don't leave crumbs on the counter. Don't use too much electricity. Don't sit in the living room when we have guests." It was as though I had become a stranger in my own bloodline's house. One evening, as I passed the kitchen, I heard my daughter-in-law again. "She's nothing but a freeloader. Once she's gone, we'll finally have peace." And my son, my boy, laughed. "You're right. She eats but doesn't contribute. Let her go rot in that home." My knees nearly gave out, but I didn't let them see me fall. I walked back to my room with my head held high. Inside, I whispered to myself, "They will regret this. Every cruel word, every laugh, every look of disdain, they will pay." The box of documents sat on my bed. Deeds, contracts, forgotten property, my husband's last gift to me, the very thing they believed didn't exist. I ran my hand across the faded paper and felt something ignite inside me. Not sorrow, not helplessness, but power. Yes, they had pushed me to my breaking point. They had stripped me of dignity, but they had also given me something else, the perfect reason to fight back. And I knew I would not fight with anger. I would fight with silence, with patience, with precision. They wanted me gone? Then I would leave, but not empty-handed. That night, I began to plan. I sat under the dim bulb in my small room, papers spread across my lap, and whispered to myself, "They think I am nothing, but soon they will learn I am everything." And with that thought, the seed of revenge took root in my heart. I had thought I'd reached the bottom, but the bottom is a shape that changes. It folds, it hides new edges, and when I hit it, something broke inside me, not my spirit, something else. The last thread of blind trust. The morning after they told me to go rot, I walked to the small shed behind the house. It was a place I hadn't visited in years. My husband kept the tools there, old, stubborn things. When he died, we let the shed grow quiet. Dust settled on the boxes. Time forgot it, until I pulled the loose board behind the old workbench and found the hollow space he'd once used to hide a bottle of medicine. In that dark pocket was a tin box, my name scratched on the lid with his shaky handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed cloth, were papers. Not bills, not junk, real papers. Deeds, old receipts, a map folded into quarters, a letter in my husband's looping script, "For you when the time is right," it read. I read it 3 times. 4. The words were simple, but they landed like thunder. He had bought land years ago. Small, cheap then, useless then, but he had kept it. Quietly. He had believed in something I did not yet understand. The map had a red circle, a name I recognized in the margins, a district that had been nothing but fields the last time I saw it. Now the town was crowded. Developers had been talking, rumors I had ignored over tea with neighbors. My heart beat in my throat. This could be nothing. It could be everything. I took the papers to the only person who still remembered my husband and still kept his promises, Mr. Kahn. He was the old lawyer who had once handled our tiny affairs. He had a stooped back and a memory like a ledger. I'd seen him at the mosque, always with his worn briefcase and kind, tired eyes. He didn't need time to look. He read them and then looked at me as if I had stepped out of a long dream. "By God," he said softly, "tell me where you found these." I told him. Every detail came out in a rush. The loose board, the shed, the tin box, the letter, the map. He listened like the walls themselves were leaning in. "This land," he said finally, "is in the path of a new ring road. The developers have been trying to buy every plot for months. The price has tripled since last year." Tripled. The word tasted strange in my mouth. It was big, scary. It was also the first time in months I felt something resembling hope. Mr. Kahn came to my modest room that afternoon. He sat across from me and pushed a cup of tea toward my hands. His fingers trembled as if deciding whether to touch a live wire. "You don't have to do anything rash," he said. "We can handle this quietly. You don't need their permission. The deeds are in your name." In my bones, I felt the old life stir. The evenings of whispered plans with my husband, the small victories, the quiet dignity of surviving. But what stopped me cold was a new question. What would telling them do? Would it invite their greed, their cruelty, or would silence be the better weapon? I thought about returning, about slamming the deeds on the dining table and watching them choke on their own words. But Mr. Kahn shook his head. "Silence is your strength. Let them drown in their assumptions." His plan was careful. It was lawful. It was slow. It used every inch of silence and patience I had left. It would also sting them where it hurt, in their pride, their reputations, their very sense of safety. That night, I walked the streets alone. The city hummed with life. New buildings cut the sky. Men in suits argued on sidewalks. Young people laughed like the future had no limits. I had been invisible for so long. But the papers in my bag felt heavy with possibility. I began small. I asked Mr. Kahn to appraise the land. He met with developers under the guise of a routine check. He set the wheels in motion without a sound. Offers came. They whispered numbers that made my hands go cold. Figures I had only seen in the margins of newspapers. Figures that would change the next few years of my life. But I could not sell without caution. I remembered how quickly men could turn, how my own son had. I remembered how greed could warp a face I loved. So I listened. I watched. I waited. I let them come to me in their arrogance and assume the worst. They would look for me and find only an empty room and a woman who seemed to be fading. They would think the house was a liability. They would think she had nothing. Inside, I began to plan more than a sale. I began to plan a lesson, not in anger, not in vengeance that breaks the law, but in exposure, in dignity reclaimed, in public truth. Mr. Kahn taught me how to set up a trust. He explained how to gift assets to institutions that would honor my husband's memory. He showed me how to transfer ownership while keeping my own life secure. His eyes were steady. His voice was careful. I felt a fierce gratitude for this aged man who had become my ally. There were nights I felt afraid of being discovered, afraid that my children would find out and come with lawyers of their own, hungry and loud. There were mornings I thought of giving up, of admitting defeat and crawling back. My chest ached with the choice, but every time fear pressed in, I thought of the spoon that had trembled in my hand when my son suggested I be moved to a home. I thought of the birthday laughter. I thought of the way my grandson had called me a burden. Those memories hardened into resolve, so I kept my face soft. I cooked when called. I mended a shirt or two. I let them belittle me. I let them plot my removal. All the while, I moved pieces on a board only I could see. The turning point was not a thunderclap. It was a quiet pivot. A change in a small room with a tin box and a patient lawyer. I had been taken for granted my whole life. Now I would take back my silence and turn it into something fierce. And as the first offer arrived in an envelope marked in a developer's neat print, I felt something like the old fire. Not the fire of rage, the steady, hard flame of someone who knows they will survive. I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer. Outside, the city rattled on. Inside, I held my breath. What happens next? I decide who I will be. I decide how I will strike. I signed the papers with hands that didn't tremble. The ink felt heavy, final, sacred. Mr. Khan had arranged everything to look ordinary. A discreet sale, no headlines, no parade, a clean transfer to the developer. They offered more than I ever imagined. It was enough to buy freedom. It was enough to undo years of want. But I did not pocket it all. That would have been petty. That would have been obvious. Instead, I built a plan like one, stitches a coat, layer by layer, with care. I placed a part into a secure account for myself. Enough for rent, doctors, small luxuries, and the peaceful life I had denied myself. I placed another part into a trust, in my husband's name, for women like I had been, for girls whose mothers worked double shifts, for widows who woke to an empty bed and a harder world. And the rest? I seeded it into the community, schools, clinics, scholarships, silent gifts with my name hidden, small flames of hope where there had been darkness. But the sweetest stitch was the legal string tied tight around their expectations. I amended the will. I clarified ownership. I left explicit instructions. No inheritance for those who had abandoned me. A large portion directed to causes that would honor the very values my husband and I had fought for: hard work, dignity, education. The lawyers made sure every I was dotted, every T crossed. Then I watched, quietly, patiently. I let them choke on their assumptions. The first sign of unraveling came in the little things. My son found the mailbox one morning stuffed with envelopes. Not bills, notices, invitations. Invitations addressed to Mrs. Noor, to speak at a community dinner, to be a mystery benefactor, honored for her charitable work. Photos of a smiling woman holding a check for a school project appeared in the local paper. No name, no fanfare. Just a face people began to recognize. They saw the article. They recognized the face. They recognized the hands. They called the number listed in a panic. The phone number connected them not to me but to a small foundation's office. "She prefers to remain private," the voice said, "but she's very involved." Panic tastes like copper. They started to whisper. Neighbors who had once been polite now glanced with curiosity. The daughter-in-law tried to keep the house calm, but her voice had the tremor of someone fearing exposure. My son's confident stride faltered. They tried to find me. They searched the house. They rifled through drawers and called every relative. They put notices on community boards. They asked the grandchildren's teachers if anyone had seen their grandmother. Their desperation made them sloppy. One evening in the middle of a market, I watched them arrive. Not together. Not with the arrogance they'd worn at the dinner table. They came small, anxious, eyes darting. They asked stall owners, they knocked on doors. I saw my son stop and stare at a headline on a paper stand. His face went the color of old plaster. "What is it?" my daughter-in-law hissed. He read aloud, choking on the words, "Local Widow Fund School, anonymous donor revealed as Mrs. Noor." They kept moving, hoping the story was wrong. They hired a lawyer. They asked for meetings. They offered to help manage my affairs. They begged. They pleaded. They pretended. The hypocrisy made my skin crawl. The son who once laughed at my birthday was now on his knees, voice soft, promises pouring from him like rain. "We can fix this. We can—" He offered to renounce his claim against me. He promised to be different. I listened to everything. I listened and watched their faces crumble as reputations slipped away. The daughter-in-law's friends began to avoid their home. Rumors spread that the family had tried to push an old woman into a home while they spent freely. People I had known my whole life looked at them with a new, uneasy gaze. Then the confrontation came, exactly how I had not scripted it but expected. They found me one afternoon at a community center where I was teaching young mothers to sew. My grandson was there, folding tiny shirts with concentration. My son stood in the doorway, all the color gone from his cheeks. He blamed me first. "Why didn't you tell us? Why keep this hidden?" I answered with a truth that felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Because you treated me like I had nothing. Because when I needed you, you laughed. Because I wanted you to see what your words cost." He opened his mouth to protest. He wanted to say I had tricked him, that I had been deceitful. But my daughter-in-law, who once called me dead weight, began to tremble openly. A neighbor from the community center stepped forward and spoke without malice, only fact. "You spoke of your mother like she was disposable." We remember. People remember. Their faces fell. They had no defense that did not sound like greed. They had no defense that would not make them look small. I did not rejoice in their ruin. I felt only the quiet settling of something lost now found. The scandal did not break bones. It broke their arrogance. It punctured the air of entitlement that had been allowed to grow. In the weeks that followed, apologies arrived like late buses. Some were sincere. Some were rehearsed. I accepted none. Not yet. Not until I felt the apology in their actions. Not until I saw them building rather than taking. My life changed, yes. I moved into a small apartment with sun on the balcony. I bought a small radio. I ate what I wanted. I slept without fear. But the real change was quieter. I felt lighter, freed. I filled my days with the work I had seeded, scholarships awarded, a clinic with a clean waiting room, children's names engraved on a small plaque. My husband's name was there. My name, too, in a way that did not depend on anyone's fickle affection. They called. They came once more to my door. This time they stood and waited, not with demands, but with shame. My son's eyes held something like regret, but regret is a slow teacher. It must be shown in deeds. I let them stand in the cold that afternoon. I closed the door gently in their faces. They had taken from me 100 times over, my youth, my comfort, my dignity. They had assumed and judged. Now they had to live with the consequences of their words. And as I turned back to my sewing circle, to the hum of machines and the bright, eager faces of girls who were learning to stitch a life of their own, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Justice had arrived, not as a shout, not as a theft, but as a quiet, unassailable truth. What happens next? They try to rebuild, and I at last learn to forgive, not for them, but for myself. I wake before the sun now, not because of duty, not because of chores, but because I want to. The light through my curtains feels different, softer, warmer. It no longer feels like a burden rising, but a gift. I sit with my tea, steam curling into the air, and I smile. For the first time in years, the silence of the house is not loneliness. It is peace. I no longer wait for the sound of keys at the door. I no longer brace myself for cruel words whispered too loudly or laughter at my expense. I no longer shrink in my own home. I have my own place now, small but mine. Every corner chosen by me, every plant watered by me, every cushion, every curtain placed with my own hands. It feels like breathing after years underwater. My husband's picture sits by the window. I talk to him sometimes. I did it, I whisper. They thought I was nothing, but I showed them. I imagine him smiling, that same quiet pride he always carried, and I know he would be proud. My children still try in their way. They send messages. They knock sometimes, lingering longer than they used to. Their apologies are softer now, stripped of arrogance. But I do not rush to answer. I am not cruel. I am careful. I will never again hand over my dignity so easily. Instead, I give my time to those who value it. The sewing circle grows each week. Girls laugh as they learn. Women wipe tears as they realize they can provide for themselves. I watch them bloom, and in their strength, I see my own reflection. The foundation thrives quietly just as I wanted. And every scholarship letter, every thank you card feels like another stone laid in the road of my revenge. Not petty revenge, but justice. Because revenge does not always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with silence, with choosing yourself, with proving to the world that their words, "you eat but don't contribute," were lies spoken by people too blind to see your worth. The community sees me differently now, not as a burden, not as an old woman past her use. They see me as someone who gave when no one expected her to, and that is the sweetest victory of all. My children? They live in the shadow of what they lost, not money, not land, but trust. Trust is a currency no lawyer can restore. Respect is an inheritance no signature can buy back, and I let them live with that. Sometimes I hear the old words echo in my mind. You eat, but don't contribute. And I smile, because now I know the truth. I contributed more than they ever understood, more than they will ever match. And that truth, that unshakable truth, is my freedom. So when people ask me if I regret what I did, I answer simply, no. I found my peace, I found my worth, and I found myself again. And I close my eyes, sip my tea, and let the morning sun warm my face. Because my revenge is complete, and my life is finally my own.